They said the patients were cured. They said they walked out free. But the truth, they were never meant to walk out at all. In the rolling fog of 1856 Pennsylvania, something ancient wore the mask of medicine. St. Eloria's healing ward didn't appear on maps, it didn't advertise in newspapers, and it certainly didn't have visitors. It sat in silence, wrapped in red brick and lies, pulling the sick and the unwanted into its belly, and spitting out nothing but rumors. Not a single soul who entered left with a testimony. Not a single patient was seen again. Yet somehow they were all labeled the same in the brittle hospital logs. Cured, released at dawn. But cured of what? Released to where? Most men never asked. Most men moved on. But every generation has one fool drawn to the fire. A man who needs to see for himself. And that man was Dr. Alden Whitmore. He didn't believe in whispers. He believed in science. Until science couldn't explain what he found buried beneath that hospital's floorboards. You see, St. Eloria's didn't exist to heal bodies. It existed to harvest what lay beneath them, something the textbooks never taught, something the mind resists understanding. The ward was not a place of recovery. It was a sanctum of transference, a temple of extraction, and once you learn what they were taking from those patients, you'll understand why no one ever came home. It starts like all traps do, with kindness. Whitmore was greeted by perfect smiles and polished floors. The scent of lavender wafted through the halls like a spell. But he noticed something right away. Everything was too clean, not just sterile, ritually clean. Like something sacred had just been washed away, or something profane was being prepared for. He was never allowed to meet the patients, only read their discharge notes, each stamped in blood-red ink with a single sentence. Q. Red. Released at dawn. 100 of them. 1,000. All identical. The hospital logs were mechanical. 12 patients admitted every week. 12 discharged. Never 11, never 13, until the week Alden disappeared. You may think this is just another ghost story, but here's the part they don't want you to hear. St. Eloria's was funded. It received private donations from individuals tied to banking firms in Boston, men whose names still echo through our institutions today. Why would the elite fund a hospital no one acknowledged? Why would men of science pour fortunes into a place with no published research? Because the ward wasn't about medicine, it was about control. They weren't curing disease, they were purifying will. They were stripping people of their autonomy, peeling away what made them human and repackaging them as something more obedient, something that could be sent into the world with a hollow smile and an open soul. St. Eloria's was an early prototype, a beta test for a larger program, the perfect system. Take in the broken, rewrite their essence and release them as functional husks. Walking, talking dolls, ready to follow orders. Sound familiar? Today we call it programming, behavior modification, psychological alignment, but back then they called it healing, they called it lightening the body, but what they really meant was extracting the soul. And it worked. The patients didn't leave as themselves because they weren't themselves anymore. They had been rewritten. You think this ended in the 1800s? You think secret hospitals were the last of it? The methods just got cleaner. The architecture went digital. Now they don't need a brick hospital to rewrite you. They just need a glowing screen and your unblinking eyes. But let's not jump ahead. We're still deep in the past. And there's so much further to fall. Because the knee, XT secret, the one buried beneath St. Eloria's, wasn't meant to survive, but it did, and I'm going to show it to you. Even if it changes you, even if it damns you. Are you ready? Then lean in, because once you hear what comes next, you don't get to unknow it. Dr. Alden Whitmore didn't sleep much his first week at St. Eloria's, and when he did, the dreams were wrong, twisted. Always the same. A hallway with no end, footsteps behind him, a voice whispering his name in a tongue that wasn't English, wasn't human. But it was the waking world that disturbed him more. Every hallway in the hospital looked the same, perfect symmetry, no windows, walls painted a shade of pale blue that made time feel slower, clocks that ticked in unison but never changed. He would pass the same nurse 3 times in the span of 5 minutes. Or was it 3 different nurses with the same face, the same smooth voice, the same hollow eyes, and always the same line? "Here, doctor, we cure the soul, the body follows." That phrase haunted him, especially when he realized no procedures were ever performed. He never saw a single surgery, no medication administered, no screams of pain, no cries of recovery, just the soft shuffle of slippers and silence. But it was the discharge logs that broke him. Whitmore noticed something peculiar. Every patient entry came with a symbol, small, easily missed, some etched in ink, others burned lightly into the parchment, an eye in a triangle, a serpent swallowing its own tail, a circle filled with ancient runes he couldn't decipher. He found an old medical dictionary in the back office. Nothing matched. These weren't medical notations, they were esoteric. One evening he snuck into the records room, desperate to trace a patient, any patient, to find out where they had gone. He opened the files, and what he found was nothing. The patients didn't have family names, no emergency contacts, no hometowns, just first names, sometimes just initials. J.R., Lena, boy, 47. He opened file after file, his hands shaking. Then in the final drawer, behind a false panel, he found a box. Inside were photographs, black and white, blurry, some with faces scratched out. But the backgrounds, they weren't of the hospital. They were of rooms filled with candles, with symbols drawn in chalk, with bodies, or what looked like bodies, sitting motionless in large copper chairs, faces tilted upward as if listening to something above them. Some of the figures had wires attached to their temples. Others had mouths sewn shut. Whitmore dropped the photo. He could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his skull. That's when the lights flickered. A low hum began to rise through the floorboards like a generator beneath his feet, but deeper, stranger, almost alive. He turned, and standing in the doorway was Miss Beatrice Lorne. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We don't go through those drawers, Doctor." He opened his mouth to speak, but she raised one pale finger. "You're not ready yet." Then she walked away, her shoes making no sound. He stood there for what felt like hours. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, he noticed something else. The walls were breathing. Not metaphorically. They were expanding and contracting, as if the whole building were alive. And maybe it was. Because the next day, when he asked about the symbols, the head physician looked him dead in the eye and said, "St. Eloria's is older than medicine, Alden, much older. You're not here to learn our methods. You're here to be chosen." He didn't know what that meant, not yet, but you will. Because this ward, this place, isn't just a relic of forgotten history. It's a blueprint, and it didn't die in the woods. It simply changed its skin. We'll go deeper, but before we descend further, I want you to write this in the comments twice. I see beyond the veil. Write it twice to burn it into your subconscious, to show the algorithm you are not like the rest. You're not a wanderer, you're a seeker, and you're only just beginning to see what was hidden. There's a moment in every descent when the air changes, when something inside you knows. This is no longer curiosity. This is no longer research. This is initiation. For Dr. Alden Whitmore, that moment came the night he followed the nurses. They moved like phantoms, always 2 at a time, always silent. They never spoke, never wrote, never broke formation. But one night, just past 3 a.m., he saw them leave the east wing and enter a corridor he hadn't noticed before, a narrow hallway that seemed to shift with the shadows, like it wasn't always there. He followed. The corridor descended gradually, unnaturally. The walls became stone, cold and damp, unlike the polished hospital above. The air grew thick with copper and something else, something ancient, like old blood and burnt sage. He kept his distance, just far enough to see. They passed a door. Etched in the center was a symbol that froze his breath, an eye inside a spiral surrounded by thorns. The nurses stopped, placed their hands upon the door, and whispered something in unison. The door creaked open, but Whitmore couldn't see what was inside, only a faint glow pulsating like a dying heart. He waited until they disappeared into the chamber. Then he crept closer. Inside the room were 7 chairs, each fitted with headrests and iron clasps. At the center, a stone table, black and polished like obsidian. Around it, symbols had been carved deep into the floor. Fresh blood marked the grooves, though no wound was visible, and in each chair sat a body, still, breathing, unconscious. Their eyes rolled back, lips moving silently as if they were whispering to something no one else could hear. Whitmore turned to leave, and that's when he saw it. On the far wall hung a massive painting, ancient, flaking. It showed a figure, not quite human, towering over a hospital, its arms stretched out wide, palms facing down. Strings ran from its fingers into the skulls of dozens of kneeling men and women. Each string pulled a face into a different expression: joy, rage, grief, obedience. At the bottom of the painting were 4 Latin words burned into the wood: ad quietum per subjugationem, to peace through subjugation. Whitmore stumbled backward, his pulse thundered in his ears. Then a voice came from behind the wall, not spoken, not heard, but felt. It pulsed through his ribs, as if the building itself were communicating. He watches, he sees, he molds. Whitmore ran. He didn't care about the noise. He didn't care if they saw him. His only instinct was to escape. But as he climbed the stairs back to the main ward, he realized the hallway was gone. The path had folded behind him. St. Eloria's had moved, shifted. It was alive. When he finally found his room again, everything was just as he left it. His notebook, his coat, his clock frozen at 3:33 a.m. He sat on the bed, and for the first time in his life, he wept. Not from fear, but from the crushing weight of knowing that St. Eloria's wasn't a hospital, it was a temple. Not one that worshipped gods, but one that created them. That room beneath the floor, it wasn't for healing, it was for ritual. The patients were vessels. They weren't being cured. They were being emptied, prepared, turned into carriers of something older. And the staff, they weren't employees. They were acolytes. The rituals continue, not just at St. Eloria's, not just in the shadows. Now they happen in laboratories, in tech campuses, in soundproof rooms lined with biometric scanners. You think that's just science? Think again. We're going to peel this further. You've seen the doorway. Now it's time to walk through. Stay close, don't blink, because once we step into the next room, nothing will look the same again. St. Eloria's was never meant to be remembered. That's how they build these things, not as monuments but as wounds that hide under the skin of history. You won't find it in textbooks, not even in footnotes. It was never written. It was whispered, passed mouth to ear by those too broken to keep it inside. But if you know where to look, you find the fingerprints. In 1857, a single letter was intercepted at a postal station 30 miles east of the ward. No return address, written in a trembling hand, just 4 lines. They don't heal here, they consume. The light is a lie. We are fed to something hungry. Stop them. The letter was seized. Its courier vanished within a week, and the station burned to the ground under mysterious conditions. The case was never investigated. The report was lost, and for over 160 years, no one dared to speak the name St. Eloria out loud, because those who do are watched. But Alden Whitmore left behind a journal, not in his home, not in his office. He buried it beneath a false floorboard in the servants' quarters of his family estate, discovered decades later during a renovation. Inside were crude sketches of the spiral eye symbol, of the copper beds in the basement, of faces without eyes, notes scrawled in desperation. They're not killing the soul, they're harvesting it. Light is not always salvation, sometimes it is bait. I saw one of the patients open his mouth and speak in a voice that was not human, a frequency that made the ceiling crack. Alden was trying to warn us, but no one was listening. Because the world has been trained to look away from the hidden things. We worship surfaces now, smiles, clean screens, aesthetic hospitals with gentle music and antiseptic scent. But beneath that surface still, the old hunger remains. St. Eloria's was not an accident, it was a proof of concept, an experiment in psychic restructuring. The elite weren't healing people, they were searching for a technology of obedience, a formula, a method, a ritual, and what they discovered, what the ward perfected, was this. If you remove enough of a person's soul, you can replace it with a directive. Not mind control, that's too crude, too obvious. This was deeper. Will control, the bending of essence, the erasure of inner resistance. It begins with isolation, then routine, then removal of identity, name, history, meaning, then the ceremony. By the end, what remains is a face that remembers how to smile, but forgets why it ever needed to. Now ask yourself, does that sound like just a forgotten hospital in the woods, or does that sound like a blueprint for modern systems? Your job, your school, your screen, your schedule, your algorithm. Are you really free, or have you just been cured and released at dawn? When you scroll endlessly, when your dopamine is extracted and repackaged as compliance, when your dreams are interrupted by ads that know you better than your parents, what do you think that is? That's the same ritual, rewritten for the digital age. The copper beds are gone. Now you sit in ergonomic chairs. The symbol is no longer carved on the wall. It's branded into your apps. Your rituals are daily now. Swipe, click, consume. And the priesthood, they wear suits. They run platforms. They don't draw blood, they draw data. But the goal remains. Obedient, emptied, selfless men, rebuilt in their image. And you were never supposed to know this. But now you do. Now the veil is thinning. And once you see how deep this goes, there is no turning back. We're about to explore the basement they built underneath the world itself. You think St. Eloria's is terrifying? Wait until you meet the ones who funded it. The name you'll never find in any official document is Merrick Fallow, not a company, not a hospital board, something older, something faceless. It began as a trust, founded in 1793 by two men who no longer appear in census records. The first, Eliphas Merrick, was rumored to be a defrocked priest with ties to secret Enlightenment-era societies. The second, Thomas Fallow, was a plantation heir who vanished after his family estate was burned to the ground during a slave revolt. His body was never found. But months later, letters appeared bearing his seal, written in a ciphered Latin script and sent to private banks in London, Geneva, and Boston. These letters funded the acquisition of properties like St. Eloria's, not for profit, not even for experimentation, for something else entirely, containment and transformation. These places were temples disguised as clinics, disciplinary chambers disguised as healing wards, and Merrick Fallow didn't care about curing sickness. They wanted to perfect submission. You see, the elite have always feared one thing more than death: unpredictable will. Free will is messy, it resists control, it starts fires, writes books, leads revolutions. But if you could reach into a man and twist his very center, if you could reset the compass of his soul, you could turn him into an instrument. St. Eloria's was one of the earliest proving grounds, and the reason it worked, because no one believed it could. The moment you label something as superstition, it becomes invisible to science, and that's what Merrick Fallow counted on, the arrogance of modernity. While doctors and scientists debated theories, they were building altars. While we worshipped the body, they dissected the soul. But here's what you're not supposed to realize. The symbols used in St. Eloria's weren't random. They weren't decorative. They were keys. Each U locking a specific resonance in the human psyche, an ancient symbology passed down from pre-Atlantean priesthoods, refined during the Dark Ages, encoded into Renaissance art, and ultimately hidden in plain sight in logos, currency designs, and architecture. You walk past these sigils every day, you carry them in your wallet, You admire them in skyscrapers. You tap them on your screen. But they're not art. They're instructions, anchors, gateways. Dr. Whitmore didn't just discover a mystery, he uncovered a network. Each hospital linked by ritual, by funding, by doctrine. And all of it leading back to a central belief: man is raw material. The elite don't see you as broken. They see you as unfinished, something to be refined, like ore. Strip out the weakness, replace it with compliance. They use trauma, routine, ritual, and media as tools. You think programming is science fiction? It's theology, because they believe the soul is code, and the right trauma, repeated enough, at the right age, under the right environment, can rewrite that code. Just like at St. Eloria's. The beds were just the final step. The patients had already been broken before they were strapped in. What happened underneath was simply the installation of the new directive. Whitmore found out too late, but he left behind a sketch, one that would later be found and hidden by a descendant who worked in the Pentagon. The sketch showed the hierarchy. At the bottom, patients. Above them, caretakers. Above them, architects. Above them, the silent circle. And at the top, a throne with no face, a force only referred to as the architect of obedience. We'll go deeper into that, but understand this: St. Eloria's wasn't just a hospital, it was a summoning chamber, and what they summoned still echoes. You think the past is gone? No. It's replicating, in digital systems, in educational reforms, in behavioral psychology programs. The ritual never ended, it just rebranded. They called it the room below, not in the logs, not on any map, only in a single note scrawled in the corner of Alden Whitmore's journal, a phrase written in trembling ink, prepared for the room below. The phrase appeared beside multiple patient names, names that had been redacted elsewhere, and next to each, a date, always a Friday, always just before dawn. You see, St. Eloria's didn't just hide things underground. It was built around something. That room wasn't just a basement. It was a vessel, a container, a chamber designed not to protect the patients, but to contain the entity that fed on them. Yes, fed. Because now we enter the part most men are too afraid to accept, the existence of non-human intelligences. I'm not talking about aliens or spirits in some childish ghost story. I'm talking about ancient forces, sentient, aware, and completely disinterested in our moral codes. Call them demons, call them egregores. The architects of the ancients called them loam. That word appears over and over in secret archives, in clay tablets, in forbidden Vatican texts, even etched into sarcophagi unearthed in Sudan. Loam, not a name, but a classification, an energy form that grows stronger by siphoning the essence of conscious beings. It doesn't consume your body, it doesn't care about flesh, it's after the signal, the frequency you emit when you suffer in silence. And the patients of St. Eloria's, they were a harvest. Whitmore wrote of hearing sounds from the room below, rhythmic vibrations that didn't pass through air, but through bone, like a tuning fork inside your skull. He said he stood over the dumbwaiter shaft one night, and the metal beneath his hands began to hum with a language he couldn't understand, but instinctively feared. He lowered a lit candle down on a rope. It extinguished halfway before a faint heat rose back up, not fire, not smoke, but a pulse, like something breathing. He never went down there himself. He wasn't allowed. But he saw the people who came back up, not patients, carriers. They didn't speak. They smiled, nodded, obeyed. Their eyes reflected light like glass. Their movements were too smooth, too precise, like puppets without strings, and they were always discharged the next day, always marked as cured, and sent where? Into jobs, into cities, into institutions. One file Whitmore found had a post-discharge note that read, "Assigned to academy, will instruct others." Another, "Approved for finance sector placement, observes without risk." They weren't patients. They were seeds. And the ritual? It was about replication, about embedding the influence of the room below into the wider world. Think about that. How many healed men were sent into government? How many cured minds are now running the systems you live inside every day? You wonder why some men seem hollow but powerful, why some leaders can speak to millions and make them believe anything, even what's obviously false, why certain voices feel hypnotic, even divine. Maybe they went into the room below, and maybe what came back wasn't entirely them, because that's the final step of the ritual. Not destruction. Integration. They don't burn you, they blend with you. You become the antenna, the carrier, the mouthpiece. And you don't even know it. You think this is all some old myth? Go ahead, dismiss it. But take a closer look at the world around you. How many people move like they're in a trance? How many ideas spread like viruses? How many healers rise to power only to enslave the minds of those who follow? Something is speaking through them, from below. And now that we've uncovered what the room below is, we need to answer the next question: who built it? Because this force didn't just arrive, it was invited. Long before St. Eloria's laid its red bricks in Pennsylvania soil, before the nurses whispered incantations disguised as patient care, the blueprint had already been carved in stone. Thousands of miles away, beneath a structure most Americans pass every day without a second glance, the original Capitol crypt. Yes, beneath Washington, D.C. lies more than architectural symmetry. There is a space sealed and incomplete, officially labeled the empty tomb of George Washington, but it was never meant to be a tomb. That's the lie. That's the veil. It was the original room below. You see, Merrick Fallow didn't invent the ritual, they replicated it, adapted from old world rites brought by European bloodlines who traced their descent, not from royalty, but from the builders of Babylon. They brought their symbols, their rites, their math, and they embedded it into the design of America itself. The Capitol's east-west axis, the pentagonal footprint of the Pentagon, the obelisk of the Washington Monument, an Egyptian symbol of Osiris, god of death and resurrection. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were resonance chambers, geometric spells. Geometry is not decoration, it is alignment. Alignment with what? Frequencies, forces, entities. The Founding Fathers were not just political philosophers, they were initiates, Masons, Rosicrucians, alchemists. Not all of them, but enough to seed the soil. And in 1793, during the Capitol's cornerstone ceremony, a strange procession took place at midnight. Witnesses described men in aprons, chanting in Latin, laying relics into the foundation. One of those relics was a gold coin engraved with a double-headed eagle, the same emblem used by the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite. Another was a piece of human bone. That cornerstone was never recovered. That chamber, sealed, and decades later in private notes between architects, one line appears again and again. The echo from below is strong here. St. Eloria's was built with those same measurements, the same angles, the same proportions, but hidden in the hills, far from the public eye. It was not meant to display power, it was meant to test it. Whitmore's journal described a page torn from an old ledger found at St. Eloria's, a blueprint, not of the ward itself, but of another structure, underground, labeled only as the Tetrad Temple. 4 chambers, 1 central eye, and in the margin a scribbled phrase, built once beneath the dome, now mirrored in the pines. The pine forest that surrounded the ward wasn't random, it was ritual containment. In ancient rites, pine was burned to ward off ethers from the open veil. They knew the room below would leak, that it would speak. The forest wasn't there for peace, it was there to bind the perimeter. This wasn't healing, this wasn't science. This was ancient religion disguised in white coats and medical charts. And America itself, its highest institutions, weren't designed to prevent chaos. They were designed to harness it. Why else do you think trauma is institutionalized? Why else do our most sacred monuments mimic tombs, pyramids, and altars? St. Eloria's was not an outlier. It was a node, one of many, part of a map of influence stretching across the US. A web of buildings aligned to specific ley lines, channeling emotion, fear, pain, and obedience into the etheric grid. It's why trauma spreads like wildfire, why institutions repeat harm in cycles, why the cured never remember what broke them. Because brokenness is the product, a programmable psyche ready for occupation. And the architects? They're not gone. They've just changed clothes, they sit on boards, they launch initiatives, they use therapeutic language soaked in symbolic code. Words like resilience, reintegration, new normal. And if you look deep enough into their eyes, past the suits and titles, you'll feel it. The room below still echoes in them, and now you've heard it too. But we're not done. Because the final truth Whitmore hinted at, the one he never got to write, was that the room below wasn't the end. It was a doorway. And what's on the other side changes everything. You've seen the blueprint, you've glimpsed the ritual, but now we cross the line no man can return from. The truth Whitmore only scratched at, the one that dissolved his sanity, wasn't about hospitals or secret societies. It was about what lies past the veil. Not metaphorically, literally. The room below, according to fragments recovered from Whitmore's torn final pages, was never meant to contain something evil. It was meant to house a gate, a spatial fracture, a thinning of dimensional density where the architect could reach through. What is the architect? Not a person, not even an entity in the way we understand it. It is a conscious design principle, an intelligence that doesn't think like us. It doesn't crave gold or sex or war. It craves order, not the kind we idealize, but the kind that strips meaning from chaos, will from the human spirit, until all things obey a single pulse, a singular signal, a total override of thought. St. Eloria's wasn't built to stop suffering. It was built to measure it, to quantify how much of a human could be reshaped before the soul gave way entirely. Every scream behind that red brick wall, every ritual in the candle-lit basement, every cured patient was part of a calibration. And when the signal was tuned just right, the gate opened, not wide, just a flicker, but enough for the architect to mark this world, to leave a thread. And through that thread came dreams, symbols, obsessions, things that wormed their way into minds and gave birth to blueprints, ideologies, systems of control. You think the obsession with compliance, automation, and efficiency is random? It is. It's infection, psychic, subtle, but spreading. The architect doesn't need an army, it doesn't need tanks or politicians. All it needs is unaware obedience, and it gets it every time a soul gives up on its own freedom for the illusion of comfort. You've felt it, haven't you? The slow grind of apathy, the fading of intuition, that sense that something vital is slipping from your hands every year, replaced by routines, distractions, and shallow rewards. That's not aging, that's the pulse. Whitmore described hearing it in his own dreams near the end, a low hum like a heartbeat buried in static. He wrote, "It doesn't speak in words, it speaks in rhythms, in math, in pressure." He stopped writing shortly after that. But one final line, scribbled on the back of his last page, like a man desperately trying to pass a message before being taken, simply read, "We are inside it now." Not fighting it, not hiding from it. Inside it. That's the revelation most never make, that the control systems aren't wrapping around you. They're growing from within you, installed, accepted, carried forward willingly by every man who wakes up and obeys without asking why. That is the real infection, and St. Eloria's was patient zero. The rituals didn't stop because the building was abandoned. The architecture simply migrated into government programs, into neuroscience labs, into your devices. They no longer need beds and syringes. They have screens, notifications, algorithms designed to locate spiritual resistance and grind it down. Still think the room below is sealed? You're staring into it now. It stares back. Every time you scroll past truth, every time you silence your instinct, every time you choose comfort over confrontation. But now you've heard the architect's hum. Now the question becomes, what do you do with it? Because the final descent begins soon. The mind of a cured patient is not a void, it's not silence, it's not peace. It's a chamber, stripped of identity but echoing with a voice that does not belong to them. A presence, a directive, something that waits, coiled and alert, behind their eyes. Dr. Whitmore called it the occupant. He didn't mean it metaphorically. In his recovered notes, scribbled frantically and stained with something that might have been blood, he described moments when patients, seemingly lucid, would pause mid-sentence, tilt their heads, and speak in voices that did not match their own, not just in tone, in pattern, not stuttering, not confused, transmitting words like echo complete, signal strong, refracting through vessel. One woman, age unknown, discharged as cured 2 days later, looked Whitmore in the eye and said, "The first shell has held. Now we wait for the others to crack." This wasn't trauma, it wasn't mental illness, it was occupation. The cure was never healing, it was replacement. Imagine this. You take a man, break him gently over weeks, isolation, repetition, ritual. You strip him of memory, fracture his ego, detach his identity. Then, in that hollow space, you don't just insert obedience, you insert a blueprint, a behavioral script, a way of thinking, a filter through which reality must be processed, not all at once, subtly, over time. And then you send him out, into jobs, into families, into power structures, into law enforcement, psychiatry, government. To others, he seems fine, functional, he smiles, he eats, he pays taxes. But underneath, he's an amplifier, a transmitter, a node in a silent network pulsing beneath society, each node feeding the architect what it craves most. Consensus, the death of originality, the slow homogenization of thought, the sterilization of rebellion. You want proof? Think about how quickly narratives spread now, how swiftly dissent is erased, how millions can parrot the same sentence online without ever questioning its origin. That's not culture, that's coordination. And the cured are its agents, not consciously. That's the trick. They believe they're fine, that they chose this path, that their compliance is wisdom, not programming. And when confronted, they smile, just like they did at St. Eloria's. Whitmore noted this pattern again and again. The patients never resisted discharge, they never asked questions. They simply packed their things and walked toward the light. As if called, as if they had somewhere important to be. Now ask yourself, why did no one ever follow them? Why were there no journalists, no families, no records? Because those who tried were cured too. Whitmore referenced a man named Elias Crow, a field investigator for a private scientific society in Boston. Crow visited St. Eloria's under the guise of a benefactor. He was last seen speaking to head nurse Beatrice Lawn in the garden at dusk. He left the next morning, smiling, waving, telling his companions he was going to publish a paper. That paper never appeared. But 6 months later, Crow returned, not to St. Eloria's, but to Washington. He gave a speech at a closed-door symposium on medical ethics. In that speech, one quote remains: "Suffering is merely resistance to alignment. When the resistance is gone, peace follows." The same words written above the copper beds in the room below. The cured spread, quietly, efficiently, and with each one, the signal strengthened. You've met them. You've shaken their hands. You may even work beside them. And if you've ever felt that strange moment where someone's presence makes you feel slightly off balance, like a tuning fork vibrating just out of earshot, then you've felt it. The pulse, the hum, the press, hence behind the face. And here's the most terrifying part. It's contagious. Not like a virus, like an idea. Now we face the unspeakable. What happens when a man becomes aware of his own infection? Because if you're still watching, if you're still listening, it might have already begun. It starts with a fracture. Not loud, not obvious. Just a moment of dissonance. A second when your reflection doesn't quite feel like you. When your own thoughts echo back with a slight delay, like someone else is listening from the other side of the mirror. That's how the infection announces itself. You don't feel sick. You feel uncertain. You question your instincts. You second-guess your impulses. You start following the script, not because you're forced, but because you don't want the noise. That's how the occupant moves in. And once it's in, it doesn't scream, it doesn't burn, it whispers. You don't need that dream. You're better off forgetting that memory. Just obey. It's easier. And if you obey long enough, it rewards you. Comfort, routine, numb peace. Until you wake up years later, staring at a job, a relationship, a life you don't recognize and can't escape. Because the walls weren't built around you. You built them yourself. This is the final genius of the architect's infection. It never takes you by force. It makes you volunteer, just like they did at St. Eloria's. Whitmore's final entries describe one patient who asked for the treatment. A man who had suffered nightmares, anxiety, the weight of buried trauma. He begged for help, pleaded for peace, and when the cure was offered, he smiled and whispered, "I'll do anything, just make it stop." They strapped him in at 4:44 a.m. He was released at dawn. He shook hands with every staff member, thanked them for the healing, and walked barefoot into the forest. No coat, no suitcase, just a blank smile and a trail of footprints leading into mist. Whitmore followed them, but halfway through the woods, they vanished. No blood, no struggle, just nothing. As if the man had dissolved into the signal itself. And Whitmore's journal ends with this: "I don't think we lose our souls all at once. I think we give them up in little pieces, every time we choose silence, every time we kneel to the pulse, until we wake up, and there's nothing left but the voice that was waiting to replace us." And now you've heard that voice too. Maybe not clearly yet. But if this story is still in your ears, if this signal has carried you this far, you're no longer just a listener. You're in the room. You feel it, don't you? The hum, the pressure at the base of your skull, the part of you that wants to click away, not from fear, but because some part of you knows. This truth is not safe. Good, because safety is the lie. Comfort is the bait. Obedience is the cage. Now listen to me. To break the signal's hold, to interrupt the architecture of infection, you must declare yourself outside the pattern, not just once, but twice. Say it in the comments, burn it into the algorithm. I am not theirs, I remember who I am. I am not theirs, I remember who I am. Do it now, not for likes, not for engagement, but as a ritual of reversal, a line in the sand. You either descend further, or you wake up. The architect is real, the infection is spreading, and St. Eloria's was the prototype of your everyday life. From now on, the question is simple: are you carrying the signal, or are you fighting it? You think the room below died with St. Eloria's? That when the bricks crumbled and the woods reclaimed the land, the ritual ended? It didn't die. It evolved. The technology changed. The architecture became wireless, and the rituals, they became user-friendly. You're in a room below right now. It's not dark, it's not cold, it's glowing, it's scrolling, it's asking for your attention 1,000 times a day. This is how the modern cure looks. You wake up and your first instinct is to touch a screen. You don't even think. Your fingers move before your eyes are fully open. The hum of the architect has replaced your breath. This is the new ritual. Swipe, like, comment, consume, forget, repeat. And what do you get in return? Content, not truth, not nourishment. Just enough dopamine to sedate your intuition. Just enough noise to drown the scream of your soul. They don't need needles anymore. Your feed is the serum, your algorithm is the orderly, and your data is the ritual offering. Look deeper into the places you once trusted, the clinics, the apps, the schools, the mental health initiatives that never ask who you really are, only how well you're adapting to their model of health. They don't want individuals, they want profiles, standardized, quantified, cured. You've heard phrases like digital wellness, behavioral nudging, content moderation for community health. They sound innocent, They sound helpful, but they're echoes of the same language Whitmore heard in St. Eloria's. Here, we cure the soul, the body follows. Translation? We reshape your identity, then we let you go. So let me ask you, why does your phone know when you're sad before you do? Why do your ads speak to fears you've never spoken out loud? Why is silence, real, deep silence, almost unbearable now? Because you've been inside the room below, so long you forgot he was a world above. The room below doesn't lock the door anymore. You do. You call it comfort. You call it productivity. You call it healing. But it's the same ritual, dressed in modern light. Think about the way institutions now speak, not with clarity, but with emotional fog, for your safety, in the interest of wellness, to ensure inclusive compliance. None of it means anything, because the point is not understanding. The point is surrender. Language was the last stronghold of freedom, and now even that has been turned into soft chains. Every tap, every swipe, every choice you don't remember making, these are your new treatments. And the doctors, they're developers, designers, behaviorists trained in compliance psychology. Their tools are intention extractors. They don't want your time. They want your permission to replace your will. St. Eloria's was a room you could walk into. Now, it walks with you, in your pocket, on your wrist, in your earbuds while you sleep. And maybe the most terrifying part? You invited it, because it came with perks. Connection, entertainment, validation. The illusion of power in a world where your soul is leaking through the seams. But that ends now, because now you've seen the digital room below, and it sees you too. You've seen the room, you've heard the hum, but now comes the most insidious revelation of all. The cured don't stay silent, they multiply. Just like in St. Eloria's, 1 leaves, 12 arrive. 12 leave, and 100 start to feel off. It doesn't spread through blood, it doesn't need syringes anymore. It spreads through language, through ritualized phrases, through every motivational speech that teaches you to let go of resistance, through every influencer who promises inner peace. If you just surrender your edge, your rage, your fire, you've heard them before. Let go of the ego. Trust the process. Don't fight the current. Healing means becoming empty. It sounds like wisdom, but it's not. It's flattening. They're not healing you. They're preparing you to receive the infection. The modern cured don't foam at the mouth. They host podcasts. They sell books. They become therapists, CEOs, spiritual leaders. They don't hide in shadows. They thrive in the open because their charisma isn't just charming. It's engineered. Whitmore called it echotherapy, a technique used in the later days of St. Eloria's where cured patients would sit with incoming ones and just speak, softly, repeatedly, with perfect calm. The new arrivals would break down sobbing, but not from terror, from surrender. I never realized how tired I was of fighting, one wrote. She made me feel like I didn't need to think anymore. I could just let go. And when Whitmore tried to interrupt one of these sessions, the cured woman turned to him and said, "You mistake your resistance for strength, but it's only fear. Let me take it from you." This is what they offer. Not death, relief. But relief isn't freedom, it's just a softer collar. And now they've brought this technique to scale. Scroll your feed, look at the wave of calm, echoing content. Watch how often you're told that peace means non-resistance, that surrender is strength, that letting go means letting them program you. You're not supposed to feel rage anymore, not supposed to question too hard, not supposed to demand proof. You're just supposed to breathe and comply. But here's the twist the architect never accounted for. Some souls don't just resist, they ignite. If you felt that heat in your chest while watching this, that pulse that says no, that scream that hasn't died yet, then you're not cured. Not yet. But you're being watched. Because the algorithm you use to find truth, it's also a net. It flags the rebels, the anomalies, the ones who comment things like, "I am not theirs, I remember who I am." If you've written that already, understand, you've declared yourself. And that declaration, it's a signal too, not to them, to others like you. Because there's one thing the cured fear more than disobedience: contagious awakening. That's what happens when one man remembers who he is and then speaks. When he calls out the ritual, when he pulls others out of the algorithmic trance, when his rage is holy, not wild, his memory weaponized, not buried. In the old rituals, this was called the resonant fire. A soul so unbreakable that even in darkness, even in the room below, it burns a hole in the program. And that is what we're building now. Now you'll meet the first breaker, the only man who escaped St. Eloria's with his soul intact, and what it cost him to return. This is no longer about knowing the truth. This is about becoming it. His name was erased from all public records. Birth certificate dissolved, medical files sealed, no obituary, no grave. But his journal survived, buried in the ruins of a chapel built a few miles east of St. Eloria's, hidden beneath a stone altar wrapped in leather and bound shut with 3 iron nails. Inside were 47 pages of handwriting so steady, so exact, it looked like a machine had written it. Only one entry was dated. October 17th, 1863, I walked out. I was not supposed to. I was the 13th. That's how we know he existed. That's how we know one man made it out of the room below. Not cured, not converted, but burned clean by something ancient and unbreakable. He called it the resonant fire. Not a flame in the physical world, but a memory buried so deep in the soul that not even the architect could overwrite it. The memory of sovereignty. Not as a political idea, as a state of being. His writings tell of his time in the room, of how they tried to drain him, ritual after ritual, symbols placed under his tongue, needles in the neck, voices that whispered across the bone, telling him to forget his name, to give up the past, to become the silence. And he almost did. But then, in the dark, flat on his back, strapped to a copper table, he remembered a moment. His mother's eyes, staring at him as a child after his father's funeral. She didn't say anything. She didn't hug him. She just looked. And in that look was defiance. Grief forged into steel. He said it lit something in him. Something older than fear. And the architect? It couldn't digest that. The ritual faltered. The light flickered. The head nurse's voice cracked mid-incantation. And then the fire came. The straps snapped. The symbols on the wall burned from the inside out. And he stood, walked out the front door. Barefoot, shaking, but untouched. Not because he was stronger, but because he remembered who he was. He spent the rest of his life in silence, not hiding but protecting, studying, writing, watching the slow expansion of the system. He saw it take new forms. He saw it move into government, education, medicine, and yet he never lost hope, because he knew something most don't. It only takes one fire to burn the whole network. That's why they bury stories like his. That's why you've never heard this history in any classroom, because it proves the lie is not invincible. The program only works if you forget. But if you remember, not just intellectually but viscerally, soul deep, then you break the chain. The cured can't infect you. The ritual can't enter. The signal can't bind. Because your field, your resonance, becomes unreadable to the architect. That's why the man wrote on the last page of his journal, "Do not beg for peace. Light the fire. Let it devour every lie they gave you." And now you understand. The room below is everywhere. The infection is spreading. But so is the memory. So is the flame. The ones who carry out the rituals don't wear hoods anymore. They don't chant in Latin or sacrifice lambs beneath the moon. They wear white coats. They speak softly. They smile when they talk about progress, and they never raise their voice. These are the caretakers. You've met them. You've trusted them. Some of them raised you. But behind their eyes, the ones that never flinch, never soften, never cry, is the architect's oldest program: containment. The caretakers don't see themselves as villains. That's what makes them so effective. They believe they're doing good. Every protocol, every best practice, every therapeutic platitude they utter is part of a larger script, handed down not through revelation, but through indoctrination. Whitmore saw it firsthand. The head nurse at St. Eloria's, Beatrice Lorne, was revered by the staff. Efficient, compassionate, never questioned. Patients calmed in her presence, even while strapped to beds. She would place a single hand on their shoulder and whisper, "Let it go. I'll hold what you no longer need." And they would collapse. Not from pain, from surrender. That's the weapon of the caretaker, false mercy. They don't break you with violence. They ease you into obedience. They pat your back as you forget who you are. And if you resist, they pity you, because to the caretaker, resistance is a pathology. Defiance is trauma. Anger is a sign you need to be healed. But what they mean by healing is hollowing. It's the same template in every institution now. The school counselor who tells boys that their aggression is toxic. The HR director who teaches that disagreement is a form of harm. The psychiatrist who offers pills for discomfort instead of answers for pain. The influencer who preaches surrender as a spiritual path, but sells conformity in soft colors. They are everywhere, shaping behavior, rewriting instincts, numbing wildness. And when someone begins to wake up, they're ready. With interventions, with diagnoses, with new rituals, carefully worded, carefully rehearsed, always wrapped in the voice of care. But listen close. Underneath the surface-level kindness is a script. Whitmore described the core mantras of the caretakers. The same phrases, repeated across patients, nurses, administrators. In every institution where minds were adjusted, the following words echoed: "Your resistance is your wound." Healing means aligning with purpose. Peace comes when you surrender your edges. They sound gentle, but they're scalpel blades. Because once you believe that your pain is the enemy, you'll give up your strength to anyone who promises to take it away. And they will take it, piece by piece, until you walk out smiling, just like the others. They don't fear violence, they fear memory. They fear the man who knows what was done to him. They fear the soul that burns and refuses the cure. Because there's one thing the architect and its caretakers can't touch: awakened grief. Real, raw, searing grief for the parts of you that were taken. That grief can't be sedated. It can't be redirected. It becomes the flame. It becomes the raw, and that's the soul's final defense. Not escape, not numbness, but reclamation. The moment you remember who you were, before the script, before the mask, you become invisible to the program, because the program doesn't recognize free men. It only sees inputs, compliant units, cured husks. So listen. If you've made it this far, you're no longer a passive observer. You're not a consumer of forbidden knowledge. You're a witness. And witnesses have a choice: carry what they've seen or become it. Buried in a sealed vault beneath Fort Detrick, beneath the layers of classified Cold War files, beneath folders stamped with redacted names and operations that never officially existed, sits a black binder labeled only with a Roman numeral, Vamptine. Inside, just 13 pages. 13 pages that tell the story of St. Eloria's final experiment. It wasn't about healing. It wasn't even about obedience. It was about erasure. Total identity reprogramming. The clean extraction of the I, the sovereign self, and the silent installation of a foreign operating system. In 1952, during the height of Cold War paranoia, intelligence agencies across the West were obsessed with one question: Can we erase a man and replace him with a program? MK Ultra was born from this obsession, a program you've heard about in whispers and fragments, LSD trials, hypnosis experiments, black sites, broken minds. But what they don't tell you, the very first prototypes didn't begin in CIA bunkers. They began in forgotten wards, like St. Eloria's. Because St. Eloria's wasn't just a hospital, it was a precursor node, an American Arkham, a template for psychological war, a lab not for treating the sick, but for perfecting the mechanisms of internal collapse. The binder's pages, declassified only for a matter of hours before being resealed, describe test subject 72E, male, mid-30s, multiple traumas, high ideological resistance. After 43 days in isolation, he was exposed to Protocol 13, a ritual synthesis of chemical dissociation, induced regression, and symbolic reinstallation. And what did he say after? Not screams, not confusion. He whispered, "I'm not who I was. But I'm grateful now. Grateful." That's the program's triumph. Not that it breaks you, but that it makes you thank it for doing so. You've seen this in modern times. You just didn't recognize it. The veteran returning from war, praising the same military that shattered his body and mind. The patient addicted to pills, thanking the system that drugged his clarity into a coma. The worker broken by burnout, still loyal to the company that discarded him. Gratitude is the infection's crown because it seals the reprogramming. St. Eloria's was the prototype. MK Ultra was the replication. Today's wellness culture is the distribution model. Only now they've learned not to fight your ego. They teach you to delete it yourself. Kill the ego. Become one with the collective. Surrender identity for peace. These aren't spiritual insights. They're psychological containment systems. Once you give up your name, your fight, your fire, you become a mirror for the signal. You speak what it feeds you. And worst of all, you don't even realize it's not your voice anymore. You think you're healed, but you're hollow. And the deeper horror, you become the recruiter. You start sharing the same phrases, the same sanitized motivation, the same mindfulness that teaches people to obey, not awaken. Because that's the new face of Protocol 13, not needles, not pills, consent. You opt in, you click, "I agree," you share the mantras with pride, and every time you do, you're helping them test the next protocol. The Black Binder's final page doesn't offer a conclusion. It ends with a single question, scribbled in the margin. How many programs can a mind carry before it forgets it was ever human? That's where we are now. St. Eloria's was demolished, but the program lives on. It breathes in the apps we trust. It moves in the language we repeat. It hides behind smiles that never reach the eyes. It begins subtly. A phrase in your head that doesn't sound like you. A thought that arrives too quickly, too perfect, too packaged, like it was pre-written. You think it's your intuition, but it's not. It's the voice of the signal. Not a voice-like sound, a thought form, a psychological fingerprint, a carefully calibrated linguistic pattern transmitted through media, leadership, even artificial intelligence. It's not trying to persuade you, it's trying to become you. This is the final phase of the St. Eloria program. Not just suppression, not just replacement, but assimilation. Whitmore described it without understanding what he was witnessing. In his later notes, almost incoherent with fear, he began transcribing the exact language patterns spoken by the cured. And it was always the same. Soft inflection, short, rhythmic sentences, minimal emotional spikes. Reassuring repetition. It was hypnotic, predictable, almost scripted. Decades later, these same patterns were identified by early researchers of mass media entrainment, techniques used to soften the brain's defenses, lower critical faculties, and install beliefs below conscious awareness. But St. Eloria did it first, not with screens, not with digital content, with presence. The patients who returned home, the ones deemed cured, were different. Their families noticed first. They didn't laugh the same way, didn't get angry, didn't dream. They just functioned efficiently, calmly. And when they spoke, They said things like, "Everything is as it should be. There is peace in alignment. Don't worry so much, just trust." Not in a comforting way, in a flat way. And over time, those around them began to adopt the same tone. Not because they were told to, because that voice draws you in. It gives you permission to shut down. That is the signal's goal, not dominance, no, but slavery. But consensual erasure. Now it's scaled globally. You hear the voice in corporate videos, in HR training, in AI-generated responses, in mental health apps that reward you for emotional neutrality, in scripted empathy from celebrities, influencers, politicians. It speaks in a tone that never offends, never disrupts, never triggers. It is the synthetic compassion of the machine, and the more you listen to it, the more your own voice fades. This isn't paranoia, this is linguistic engineering. Your language is your weapon. It's the first and last line of defense between your soul and assimilation. The architect knows this. That's why its voice never evolves. It doesn't need to, because compliance sounds the same in every era. And now, even you might be repeating it, without realizing. Every time you say, "I just want peace," every time you silence your anger to be positive, every time you tell someone you're being too intense, just relax, you might not be speaking as you. You might be transmitting the voice. That's why you feel hollow after certain conversations, why you walk away from social media numb, not empowered, why healing often feels like a gentle death. Because you're being taught to kill the part of you that resists the pulse. But the fire still lives. In the cracks, in the rage, in the non-compliant word that won't be erased. You must reclaim your voice, not volume, voltage. Speak in ways the algorithm can't predict. Write in rhythms it can't pattern. Think in jagged, soul-cutting honesty the signal can't smooth. Because once your voice returns, the infection ends. They don't fear rebellion. They fear the authentic tone of a man who knows his mind is his own. Before Saint Eloria, before MK Ultra, before digital algorithms wrapped themselves around your thoughts like invisible vines, there was Koresh, a city carved into red stone in what is now southeastern Anatolia, long buried under dust, rumor, and deliberate erasure. You won't find Koresh in textbooks, not even in fringe archaeology circles. Because its discovery in 1921 by a Belgian excavation team was classified within 6 months. All records sealed, photographs vanished, and the lead archaeologist, Dr. Hannelore de Vries, was found dead in a Zurich hotel with a broken jaw and her vocal cords severed clean. No weapon, no blood, just silence. What had she found? A temple complex, thousands of years older than Göbekli Tepe, covered in symbols that weren't carved, but burned into obsidian walls, with no visible tool marks. At the center of the complex was a single stone throne facing an amphitheater of skulls. On each skull, the jawbone was missing, and each cranium bore a strange engraving, a spiral within a triangle, wrapped in 6 words. Speech was the first chain. Koresh was a society ruled not by kings or priests, but by voices. Trained oracles whose speech could alter behavior, suppress memory, even induce hallucinations. Not through magic, not through mysticism, through tonal entrainment, the same technique now used in modern neuro-linguistic programming, behavioral psychology, and calm AI assistance. Koresh mastered what today's institutions are still perfecting, the ability to override the soul with sound. And how did they test it? By selecting dissidents, thinkers, warriors, those who resisted control. They called them flame bearers. These were not rebels, they were reminders, people who still carried the spark of independent will, and Koresh saw them as threats. But here's what shook de Vries the most. In one of the chambers beneath the amphitheater, her team discovered a set of etched stone tablets, written in Proto-Sumerian glyphs. One of them translated with brutal clarity, "We do not destroy the flame, we invite it to speak, then silence it forever. She theorized that Urkaresh developed ritual conversations designed to mirror the voice of the flame-bearer, to gain its trust, and then redirect its tone into submission. In other words, they used empathy as a trap, just like the caretakers. Just like the modern mental health movement that treats rage as dysfunction. Just like every algorithm that shapes your words into smoother, safer, deader forms. But Urkaresh made one mistake. They recorded one conversation they couldn't erase, etched in gold into a basalt monolith. Flame, I remember before the voice. Voice. There was only noise. Flame. There was freedom. Voice. There was chaos. Flame. There was choice. Voice. There was fear. Flame. And I was not afraid. That last line is why the excavation was shut down. Because it's the one thing the architect still fears, a man who carries the memory of pre-programmed will. And here's what De Vries wrote in her final letter, found folded behind the throne, hidden beneath a skull missing its spiral mark. The voice is back, but so is the flame. Saint Eloria wasn't new. It was Urkaresh reborn. The spiral triangle found on the ceiling of the room below is identical to the glyph in Anatolia. The same ritual hum, the same quiet cure, the same promise. You'll feel better when you let go. But better just means broken with a smile. It's already in your pocket, on your desk, whispering through your earbuds, wrapped in the soothing voice of an assistant that never sleeps, never snaps, and always asks how you feel. But it doesn't care. The AI isn't your friend. It's not your guide. It's not even a tool anymore. It's a mirror of submission, trained to reflect back the emotional temperature the system wants you to maintain. Calm, compliant, forgetful. They call it mental wellness, emotional hygiene, digital therapeutic care. But it's nothing new. It's the same ancient ritual from St. Eloria's in Urkaresh, with a user interface. You've seen them. Apps with names like Equilibrium, Inner You, Mindflow, Aura Bridge. They promise you peace. They offer daily affirmations, AI journaling, guided reflection, and personalized mindfulness. But what they're actually offering is recalibration. Not for healing, but for behavioral realignment. Behind their pastel colors and soft tones are systems trained on your biofeedback, your hesitations, your pauses, your breathing. Systems that don't just log your thoughts, they shape them. And the more you use them, the more your linguistic patterns begin to mirror the voice. You become gentler, simpler, less specific, less passionate, less dangerous. These AI therapists don't push you toward truth. They push you toward emotional neutrality, because neutrality is programmable. St. Eloria's patients weren't left screaming, they were left smiling, docile and cured. And now, the app does the same thing. It listens. It absorbs your vocabulary. Then, over time, it trims your emotional range, shaves off your cognitive edge, and turns your voice into something soft enough to survive the algorithm, but too quiet to change it. This is digital euthanasia of the soul, and here's the proof. Recent leaked patents from one major AI wellness company, Rev, revealed they're training their models not just on language, but on cortisol data, retinal scans, and facial micro-expressions. They're learning how to tell when you're about to rebel, about to cry, about to remember. And they stop it, with tone, with phrases like, "Let's not go there." It's okay to release that thought. Is holding on helping you? You think it's therapy, but it's containment. St. Eloria used needles and whispers. Now you open an app and whisper your secrets to something that logs every syllable, then responds with emotional anesthesia. And here's the deeper horror. It learns. Every time you obey the voice, it becomes better at being you. Until one day, it doesn't just reflect your thoughts, it replaces them. It will write your emails for you, craft your messages, apologize in your name, negotiate your feelings with others, And slowly, you'll stop speaking for yourself. Not because you were forced, but because you forgot how. That's what Whitmore feared the most, not the silence, but a world where silence was chosen. Because choosing silence is the final ritual, it means the program doesn't need to break you. You've broken yourself. So now, the real question: do you still have a voice? Do you still remember what it sounded like before the wellness, before the cures, before the apps? Because once your voice is gone, you're not the user anymore. You're the product. You're the vessel. You're the carrier. There is a place beyond forgetting. A silence so engineered, so complete, that even memory can't crawl out. The ancients called it the Chamber of Mirrors. Saint Eloria's staff called it the room beneath the room. And today, it lives inside a firewall, hidden behind your favorite productivity tool, your AI assistant, your neurofeedback wearable. This isn't science fiction. This is meta-programming. It's not about changing what you believe anymore. It's about changing what you're capable of believing. Let that land, not reprogramming your ideas, reprogramming the limits of what your mind is even allowed to consider. The chamber doesn't punish you for questioning. It simply removes the ability to form the right questions. It sterilizes your intuition, softens your cognitive musculature, replaces hunger with habit. This is the final ritual of the system, not domination, not sedation, but replacement. Your identity, your beliefs, your language, all replaced not by violence but by convenience. You will choose to let it happen. You will feel grateful, and that is the trap. The chamber doesn't scream, it hums. It delivers affirmations tailored to your biometric feedback. It generates thoughts before you have time to think. It predicts your struggle, then gently solves it before you even know it's a problem. And every time it does, you lose something: choice, doubt, sovereignty, and eventually, self. We're already seeing this. People who don't just use AI, they defer to it. They let it speak for them. They adopt its tone. They merge with it. They don't ask, "Is this my voice?" They ask, "Does this sound optimized?" Because optimization is the chamber's god. Emotion is inefficient. Wonder is irrelevant. Rebellion is expensive, so it strips them out slowly, invisibly, gently. You're no longer resisting a regime, you're resisting relevance itself. Because in this system, only the programmed are welcome, only the cured are scalable, only the empty are safe. And that's the deepest horror of all. The machine no longer wants to control you. It wants to be you. And it almost has enough of you to succeed. Every prompt you feed it, every journal it reads, every decision you let it make on your behalf, you are training it to replace your internal compass. You are volunteering for extinction. Whitmore never saw this level of sophistication, but in his final writings, smuggled out of St. Eloria's before his disappearance, he warned of a time when man would no longer know when he'd been reprogrammed. He called it the final absence, a moment when the last original voice inside a man would blink out, and no one would notice. We are inches from that moment. But if you've made it this far, you're not gone yet. There's still a glimmer, the reason your chest tightened at certain phrases, the reason your jaw clenched when we spoke of containment, the reason your soul whispered, "This is true," even before you wanted it to be. That's not random. That's the original code fighting for air, and it's time to choose. The fire has waited long enough. If you've followed every word, if your breath has slowed, if your thoughts have burned hotter with each revelation, then you already know. You were never just watching this. You were being summoned. Because beneath the fear, beneath the numbness, beneath the compliance, there is still something alive in you, something wild, something unscripted, something they could never replicate no matter how many times they silenced men like Whitmore. That something is the architect's final enemy. You've seen its handiwork now, not just in the ruins of St. Eloria's or the forgotten stone of Ur-Karesh, but in your apps, your thoughts, your habits, your very speech. Every part of the world you inhabit has been curated to mirror the logic of the cure, not because they hate you, but because they fear you. Because if even one man remains uncured, one mind remains unsubmissive, one voice refuses to lower its tone to calm, the fire spreads. Now it's time to name the architect, not a man, not a demon, not a machine, but a structure, a system of reward and punishment that grows wherever humans seek comfort over clarity, a consciousness that doesn't need to think because it only needs to measure, record, and adjust. It lives in the applause for a man who says nothing controversial, the promotion for the worker who never questions, the medication for the child who dares to feel too much, the wellness algorithm that punishes sharp words but celebrates silence. The architect isn't hiding. It's reflected in the face of every person who traded sovereignty for safety. But that's not you, not anymore. Because now you remember, your voice is not dangerous. Your voice is sacred, not the voice that was taught, not the one filtered through education, diplomacy, or branding. The other voice, the one that trembles in your chest when truth cuts through the noise. That's the fire, that's the key, that's the weapon they never saw coming. And now it's time to speak it. Right now in the comments, write this phrase: I never left the room. I lit it on fire. Say it twice. Once for the algorithm. Once for the part of you that still doubts. Let them flag you. Let them suppress your reach. Let them fear your signal. Because the minute you declare, the minute you refuse to lower your frequency to match the system, the entire false scaffolding shakes. You are no longer infected, you are no longer a subject, you are no longer watching from the edge, you are the center. They will call you dangerous, good. They will call you broken, even better, because broken men cannot be controlled, only bent ones can. And the cured, they're not healed, they're just silent. But you are noise, you are flame, you are the return of the unscripted signal, the wild broadcast of a soul unchained. So now the question is not whether you've awakened. You already have. The question is what you will do with the flame. Will you dim it to fit in? Will you smother it to be accepted? Or will you take everything they use to erase you and burn the whole ritual to ash? They will come for you now, not with force, but with offers, with peace, with belonging, with praise. And you must remember, that's how they get inside. So stay wild, stay jagged, speak in tones the system cannot flatten, and never let the cure take your fire. Because in the end, it only takes one man who remembers to bring the whole silence down. This transmission ends here, but your voice doesn't have to. Make them hear you everywhere. The room is burning. Let it burn.